Russia had calculated that the Arctic would remain its frozen fortress, an impenetrable sanctuary where NATO could never challenge Moscow's dominance. However, on March 14, 2026, a coordinated series of military deployments across 7 NATO nations shattered that assumption forever. What Putin believed would be his strategic safe haven has become the most vulnerable theater in Russia's entire defense architecture. The transformation happened not gradually over years, but explosively over mere weeks, catching the Kremlin completely unprepared for what NATO had been planning in absolute secrecy. The images you are about to see on your screens will demonstrate the scale of NATO's Arctic buildup in ways that satellite imagery alone cannot convey. What you see is not routine exercises or symbolic gestures. The footage shows permanent infrastructure installations, advanced sensor networks, and fifth-generation aircraft positioned at bases less than 200 kilometers from Russia's most critical strategic assets. But that is not the most shocking detail. There are 3 factors that have transformed the Arctic from Putin's sanctuary into his strategic nightmare. The first is Norway's deployment of F-35 squadrons to forward Arctic bases with response times measured in minutes rather than hours. The second is Finland's integration into NATO's northern defense architecture, creating an unbroken 1,340-kilometer border that Russia cannot possibly defend. The third factor involves technological breakthroughs in Arctic warfare capabilities that have eliminated every natural advantage Russia has relied upon for decades. We will explain how these 3 elements combine to create an inescapable trap for Moscow's northern strategy in the later parts of this video. Now we must examine where this extraordinary transformation began. On February 8, 2026, Norwegian Defense Minister Bjørn Arild Gram announced the Arctic Shield Initiative, a $4.2 billion program combining infrastructure development with forward deployment capabilities. By February 22, Finland committed 3,500 additional troops specifically to its northernmost regions adjacent to Russia's Kola Peninsula. Sweden, having joined NATO in March 2024, deployed Gotland-class submarines to Arctic patrol routes for the first time in the nation's history. According to reports from the Institute for the Study of War, these announcements represented the public face of coordination that had been occurring in classified channels for over 8 months. The timing was deliberate. NATO waited until Russian forces were maximally committed in Ukraine before executing a northern strategy that Moscow cannot counter without catastrophic redeployment decisions. The Kola Peninsula represents the geographic heart of Russia's strategic nuclear deterrent. This frozen appendage of land jutting into the Barents Sea houses the naval bases of Severomorsk, Polyarny, and Gadzhievo. These installations host approximately 2/3 of Russia's strategic nuclear submarine force, including Delta IV and Borai-class vessels carrying intercontinental ballistic missiles. The peninsula sits less than 180 kilometers from Norwegian territory, a proximity that has defined Arctic security calculations since the Soviet era. According to German intelligence assessments, Russia has invested over $60 billion in Kola Peninsula infrastructure since 2010, constructing hardened submarine pens, nuclear maintenance facilities, and command bunkers designed to survive direct strikes. The investment makes sense only if the facilities remain secure. That security assumption has now collapsed. Let us examine the technical capabilities that have fundamentally altered Arctic warfare dynamics. Norway's recent acquisition of 52 F-35A Lightning II aircraft represents far more than a numerical increase in combat power. These fifth-generation fighters carry the AN/APG-81 AESA radar system, a sensor package specifically designed to overcome the electronic interference and atmospheric distortion that plague Arctic operations. Traditional radar systems suffer severe degradation in Arctic conditions due to auroral interference, temperature inversions, and unique propagation patterns. Russian forces have exploited these natural defenses throughout their Arctic military history. The F-35's sensor fusion technology combines radar, infrared, and satellite data streams into a unified battlefield picture that penetrates environmental obstacles. According to analysis from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Norwegian F-35s stationed at Evenes Air Base can reach Kola Peninsula airspace in approximately 12 minutes from takeoff. This response time eliminates the strategic warning period that Russian submarine commanders require for emergency dive procedures or dispersal operations. The aircraft's stealth characteristics allow undetected operation within what Russia considers its air defense identification zone. Norwegian F-35s have conducted 47 Arctic patrol missions since January 2026, monitoring Russian Northern Fleet movements in real time without triggering defensive responses. Each mission generates intelligence data that feeds into NATO's comprehensive Arctic surveillance architecture, But the F-35 deployment represents only the visible component of Norway's transformation. The country has constructed what defense analysts describe as the most sophisticated Arctic sensor network ever deployed. The Northern Shield Early Warning Array consists of 23 ground-based radar installations, 14 signals intelligence stations, and a network of underwater acoustic sensors positioned along critical submarine transit routes. The acoustic sensors utilize technology developed by Kongsberg Maritime, originally designed for oil and gas exploration, but adapted for military submarine detection. These systems can identify submarine acoustic signatures at distances that would have been impossible using previous generation equipment. Radio Free Europe reporters granted access to one installation described facilities resembling small cities rather than military outposts, with hardened bunkers designed for autonomous operation during extended crisis periods. The sensor network creates a surveillance envelope that Russian submarines cannot penetrate undetected. Every departure from Kola Peninsula bases occurs under NATO observation. Every transit through Arctic waters generates tracking data that feeds into Alliance command systems. The strategic ambiguity that nuclear submarines require for deterrent credibility has evaporated in the Arctic theater. Russian submarine commanders know that NATO monitors their movements from the moment they leave port until they return. This knowledge fundamentally undermines the psychological effectiveness of the strategic submarine force. This brings us to the operational implications that cascade from NATO's tactical advantage. Russia's entire strategic nuclear posture rests significantly on the survivability and stealth of its submarine-launched ballistic missile force. The Delta IV and Beret-class submarines based on the Kola Peninsula carry approximately 40% of Russia's deployed strategic nuclear warheads. Deterrence theory requires that adversaries cannot confidently locate and target these submarines, creating uncertainty that prevents preemptive strikes. NATO's Arctic surveillance architecture destroys that uncertainty. If Russian submarines cannot achieve undetected deployment to launch positions, their strategic value degrades substantially. This degradation forces Russia into defensive calculations rather than the offensive posturing that has characterized Putin's approach to NATO relations. Moscow must now consider that in any crisis escalation scenario, NATO possesses the capability to track and potentially neutralize a significant portion of Russia's submarine-based nuclear deterrent before those vessels reach safe operating areas. The strategic implications extend beyond immediate military calculations into broader geopolitical consequences. Let us move our focus eastward to examine how Finland's NATO accession compounds Russia's Arctic predicament. Finland's 340-kilometer border with Russia represents the longest border any NATO member shares with the Russian Federation. On January 15, 2026, Helsinki announced the Forward Defense Initiative, allocating $3.8 billion for northern border fortification and force modernization. The Finnish defense forces maintain a wartime mobilization capability of 280,000 troops, the largest standing army of any Nordic nation. This force structure results from Finland's comprehensive conscription system and reserve mobilization doctrine. Finnish military training emphasizes Arctic and winter warfare not as specialized skills, but as fundamental competencies expected of every soldier. The Finnish army has perfected defensive tactics in harsh terrain over generations, creating a force specifically designed to inflict maximum casualties on invading armies while preserving defensive strength. The city of Ivalo in northern Finland, positioned just 285 kilometers from Murmansk, has transformed into a major NATO logistics hub. Satellite imagery from March 2026 shows extensive construction of fuel storage facilities, ammunition depots, and vehicle maintenance complexes. These installations enable sustained NATO operations in the high north without vulnerable supply lines extending from southern Europe. According to preliminary data from NATO strategic planning documents, the logistics infrastructure can support a reinforced division for 6 months of continuous operations using pre-positioned stocks. The integration of global partners including Japan, South Korea, and Australia into Arctic support mechanisms through the Global Partners Initiative means that critical components and supplies can route through multiple pathways, eliminating single points of failure that adversaries might target. Finland's geographic position creates an L-shaped strategic vice around the Kola Peninsula when combined with Norwegian capabilities. Russian forces face potential NATO operations from both western and southern approaches, forcing defensive dispersal that dilutes available strength. Now let us turn our attention from military hardware to examine the economic warfare dimension that makes Russia's Arctic position even more desperate. The Kola Peninsula and Russia's broader Arctic territories contain extraordinary natural resource wealth. Nickel deposits in the Norilsk region represent approximately 30% of global reserves. Natural gas fields beneath Arctic waters hold an estimated 30 trillion cubic meters of extractable reserves. These resources have enabled Russia to position itself as an indispensable energy supplier to Europe and Asia, leveraging resource exports as geopolitical tools. However, the combination of Western sanctions, technological restrictions, and now direct military pressure has created an impossible situation for Russian Arctic resource development. Modern Arctic extraction requires specialized equipment designed to operate in extreme temperatures and challenging conditions. According to German intelligence assessments, approximately 65% of this specialized equipment comes from Western manufacturers who have ceased all cooperation with Russian entities following the Ukraine invasion. Russian domestic production cannot fill this gap. The precision engineering required for deep-water drilling platforms, the materials science needed for extreme cold operations, and the electronic systems that enable remote Arctic facility management all depend on technology that Russia cannot produce independently at required scale and sophistication. The Northern Sea Route, Putin's vision for a Russian-controlled alternative to traditional shipping lanes, has become increasingly irrelevant as climate patterns prove less predictable than projected and insurance costs skyrocket due to geopolitical tensions. Trade volume through the Northern Sea Route fell to 34 million tons in 2025, a decline of approximately 18% from peak projections. Traditional routes through Suez and Panama, despite longer distances, offer reliability and security that the Northern Sea Route cannot match under current political circumstances. Russia's Arctic resource wealth remains locked beneath ice and sanctions, inaccessible without Western technology and investment that will not return while Putin remains in power. This brings us to the most crucial and darkest point of Russia's Arctic strategic collapse. Wars are not only lost on battlefields. Wars are lost at that breaking point when leaders wake up one morning and realize their geographic advantages have become liabilities, their investments are stranded assets, and their strategic assumptions were catastrophically wrong. Russia is racing toward that breaking point in the Arctic. The human dimension of this collapse appears in the faces of Russian naval personnel stationed on the Kola Peninsula. According to leaked reports from Russian military sources obtained by independent investigative journalists, morale among Northern Fleet sailors has reached historic lows. These are not poorly trained conscripts, but career naval officers who understand exactly what NATO's Arctic buildup means for their operational effectiveness and personal safety. Video footage shows cramped living conditions in base housing that has received minimal maintenance investment for years. While Moscow directs billions toward new weapon systems and prestige projects, the basic infrastructure supporting the humans who operate those systems deteriorates. The expression on the face of a Russian submarine officer interviewed anonymously tells the complete story. This is not fear, but resignation. The resignation of someone who has trained their entire adult life for a mission that has become impossible. Russian submarines designed to slip undetected into the North Atlantic now face acoustic sensor networks that track their every movement. Surface vessels built to project power across Arctic waters operate under constant surveillance from aircraft they cannot counter. The Northern Fleet, once the pride of Soviet naval power and the guarantor of Russia's second-strike nuclear capability, has become a garrison force trapped in bases that enemy forces can monitor with impunity. Leadership psychology in Moscow reflects increasingly desperate calculations. Putin's Arctic strategy, like his broader geopolitical approach, assumed Western disunity and gradual NATO decay. The opposite has occurred. Sweden and Finland, nations that maintained neutrality through decades of Cold War tensions, joined NATO specifically because of Russian aggression in Ukraine. The alliance that Putin sought to fracture has expanded and unified in ways that create permanent strategic disadvantage for Russia in the high north. Russian officials can appear on state television and accuse Norway of provocative behavior. They can claim that NATO's Arctic buildup threatens Russian security and violates the spirit of past agreements. But these statements cannot change fundamental geographic and technological realities. The Kola Peninsula sits exposed to NATO monitoring and potential interdiction. The Northern Fleet operates under conditions that eliminate its strategic effectiveness. Russia's Arctic resource wealth remains locked beneath ice and sanctions, inaccessible without Western cooperation that will not materialize while current leadership remains in power. Putin set out to make the Arctic Russia's strategic sanctuary. Instead, he has created another theater where Russia faces overwhelming disadvantage against an alliance that possesses superior technology, geographic positioning, and economic resources. The coming months will determine whether Russia attempts to reverse this strategic disaster through escalation or accepts diminished positioning in Arctic affairs. According to preliminary assessments from defense analysts, Russia has three potential response options, none of them attractive. The first option involves massive investment in counter-surveillance technology and upgraded northern defenses, requiring funds that Russia's sanctions-battered economy cannot easily provide without sacrificing other strategic priorities. The second option accepts the new reality and shifts focus to theaters where Russia maintains advantages, effectively ceding Arctic dominance to NATO and abandoning decades of investment and strategic planning. The third option, the most dangerous, involves provocative actions designed to demonstrate resolve and disrupt NATO coordination, risking escalation that Russia cannot afford and potentially triggering Article 5 scenarios that would be catastrophic for Russian interests. Some analysts predict increased Russian submarine activity in the North Atlantic during spring 2026 as Moscow attempts to demonstrate that its northern fleet retains operational capabilities despite NATO's surveillance advantage. Others forecast accelerated Arctic resource development partnerships with China, trading long-term strategic autonomy for short-term capital and technology access that keeps extraction projects viable. The most concerning scenario involves Russia creating incidents designed to test NATO unity and response protocols in Arctic waters, where rules of engagement remain somewhat ambiguous and gray zone operations create plausible deniability. What seems inevitable is that the Arctic has transformed from a remote theater of minimal great power competition into a critical arena where tensions will intensify throughout 2026 and beyond. Climate change continues opening new navigation routes and resource access points, raising stakes for territorial claims and military positioning. The United States has announced plans to expand its Arctic naval presence with 2 new polar security cutters and comprehensive upgrades to Alaskan military installations totaling $8.4 billion through 2030. Canada has committed $6.8 billion to Arctic sovereignty operations over the next decade, including new patrol vessels and northern airfield expansions. Denmark, through its Greenland territories, has begun cooperating with NATO on surveillance infrastructure that extends the alliance's Arctic sensor network even further westward, creating coverage that spans from Greenland through Iceland to Norway and Finland in an unbroken arc. The picture becomes very clear when examining the strategic map. Russia's Arctic territories stretch across thousands of kilometers of coastline, creating the illusion of vast strategic depth and defensive advantage. However, the concentration of critical infrastructure on the Kola Peninsula creates a single point of failure that NATO can exploit through surveillance, economic pressure, and potential interdiction. Russia cannot defend this extended frontier against adversaries who possess technological superiority and geographic positioning that allows rapid force projection. Every kilometer of Russian Arctic coastline becomes a liability rather than an asset when NATO forces can monitor, access, and potentially threaten it with minimal warning and maximum effectiveness. Only time will tell whether Putin recognizes the impossibility of Russia's Arctic position before committing additional resources to an unwinnable competition. The slow phase of NATO's northern buildup has concluded. The sudden phase, where strategic advantage translates into concrete military and economic pressure, may be much closer than Moscow anticipates or Western audiences understand. Russia set out to dominate the Arctic and secure its northern territories against any possible threat, viewing the frozen north as a strategic sanctuary that geography and climate would protect. Today, Putin finds himself presiding over a northern strategy that has transformed Russia's supposed fortress into an exposed and vulnerable position that NATO can pressure at will without significant risk or resource commitment. What are your thoughts on this dramatic shift in Arctic power dynamics? Do you think technology and geographic positioning have permanently altered the strategic balance in Russia's north, or can Moscow develop countermeasures that restore its Arctic advantage? Don't forget to share your thoughts on this topic in the comments section. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like our video so you can stay informed as these critical developments continue to unfold throughout 2026 and beyond. The ice that once protected Russia now isolates it from potential allies and reinforcement. The submarines that once represented strategic power now sit trapped in bases under constant observation, their movements tracked from departure to return. The resources that promised economic leverage remain locked beneath frozen ground, without access to Western technology needed for extraction and export. Putin's Arctic dream has become an Arctic nightmare, and the coming months will reveal just how much this strategic miscalculation will cost Russia in terms of military effectiveness, economic opportunity, and geopolitical positioning. Russia believed the Arctic would remain its sanctuary, untouchable by NATO forces and secure for generations regardless of conflicts in other theaters. Instead, the frozen north has become the latest demonstration of Putin's strategic collapse, a region where every advantage Russia once possessed has evaporated under the pressure of alliance unity, technological superiority, and patient strategic planning that Moscow never detected until implementation became irreversible. Presented by TGN. Thank you for choosing us.